Hello, everyone. My name is Esther Lee, co-founder of Chinese American Heritage Foundation. CAHF promotes the recognition, appreciation, and celebration of historical contribution made to the United States by citizens of Chinese heritage. Together, our stories will be shared and our voices amplified. Welcome to day one of our 31 days of webinars celebrating AAPI Heritage Month. Today, we are honored to have Ed Tepporn, Executive Director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, as our featured speaker. Ed will highlight the history of Asian and Pacific Islander immigration through Angel Island, some of the stories and experiences of immigrations detained at Angel Island, the monumental effort to preserve and protect the site, and the importance of remembering the site's significance in our nation's history. Without further ado, let's welcome Ed Tepporn.
Thank you so much, Esther, and happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month to everyone. It is a pleasure to be joining the Chinese American Heritage Foundation for this first of 31 webinars for this month. And what a year for all of us. It is so important for us to come together to lift our voices and to ensure that our histories and stories continue to be told so that all of our communities are treated with fairness and respect in this country. Hopefully, the results of all our efforts will make this country a safer place for all of our communities, as well as for our brothers and sisters in our other racial ethnic minority communities. I have the honor and pleasure of serving currently as the executive director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, which is the nonprofit partner that works in partnership with Angel Island State Park to preserve the buildings as well as to uplift the histories and stories related to Angel Island. Before I get into my slides, I wanted to share just a little bit about my own immigration journey. And as we talk about Asian and Pacific Islander communities, it's so important for us to remember that our communities are diverse. There's over 50 different ethnic groups that represent 100 different languages and dialects. And through all of these diversities, I think that is what makes our communities that much stronger together. So my immigration journey actually begins with my grandparents on both sides who immigrated from China to Thailand in the 1920s and 30s. There, my parents were the first on both sides of my family to have the opportunity to go to college. And so after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965 here in the US, which opened new pathways to immigration for people who were considered to have high skills. My mom was a nurse, my dad was a medical technologist. We had the opportunity to immigrate from Thailand to Texas in the 1970s. For me, I was born in Bangkok, Thailand. I grew up in Texas, and growing up in Texas in the 70s and 80s is probably different from the experience that some of you who might live in Texas now or have visited Texas now have experienced. Back then, there weren't as many Asian and Pacific Islanders in Texas, and so it wasn't uncommon for us to hear racial slurs or to experience different forms of racism and xenophobia. Although in all candidness, the things that we experienced back then doesn't even compare to what we're seeing today in terms of people getting attacked, killed even, because they are Asian or Pacific Islander presenting. But it's those early experiences for me that made me realize that as an Asian American, I was seen as being different from my fellow students. And in that universal desire for all of us to be treated with respect and fairness, that grounded within me a set of values that later turned into a career in the nonprofit sector. I've worked for over 25 years in public health advocacy and had the opportunity and privilege to join the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation about a year and a half ago. And so with that, let me share my screen so that you have an opportunity to take a virtual walk with me. And for those of you who never had the opportunity to visit Angel Island, I hope that you have a chance to do so soon once it's safe to do so again. There is nothing that can replace the feeling of emotions and the sense of connection to history that one gets when you are actually walking on the site or walking through the walls of the buildings. And so hopefully you will each have an opportunity to do that soon. So what you see on the screen is an image of the detention barracks. And these detention barracks is where over 300,000 immigrants from 80 different countries were detained on Angel Island. The majority of those were Asian and Pacific Islander due to the exclusionary policies, immigration policies of the time. And the site, this is what the site looks like today. So you'll see that it's very scenic. There's some beautiful views of San Francisco Bay. And so you have this interesting juxtaposition of the scenic beauty, but also a very emotional history. Just a little bit more about the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. This, what we see on the screen on the left-hand side, is our mission. And again, it's about preserving the buildings and helping to uplift our histories and stories. And hopefully what Angel Island does is it offers us a chance to remember this important part of our community's histories. And especially now, today, it's so important as we're seeing increasing racism and xenophobia targeted to our communities. And we're hearing questioning and discussions about whether Asians and Pacific Islanders can even experience racism or treating this racism and xenophobia as something new. The reality is that this racism and xenophobia has its roots that trace back to the times when Asian immigrants first started coming to the US, whether it was the Filipinos in 1600s or the first waves of Chinese immigrants in the mid 1800s. On the right-hand side are different ways that you can stay in contact with us at the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We have our website and some of our different social media handles. So this quote that you see on the screen just gives a glimpse at some of the racism and xenophobia that was prevalent at the time. You notice that this quote is actually from the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. And similar to how Asian immigrants, as well as immigrants from other communities today, have been stereotyped as being lesser than or being different. This is just one example of someone in a position of power who held these early racist and xenophobic attitudes. Unfortunately, he wasn't alone in holding those types of attitudes. And we know from history that, especially in places where there were different constellations and congregations of Asians and Pacific Islanders, there were similar attitudes, and that those attitudes unfortunately turned into violence in many cases. We know that Chinese communities started coming over after the discovery of gold in larger waves, in the hopes of finding opportunity, in hopes of creating a better future for ourselves and for our families. And after the gold rush, many of our community members went on to help provide labor for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. But after the railroad was completed, many of those individuals had to find their way back to the West Coast. They weren't allowed to ride on the railroad trains that they helped to build along the tracks that they helped to build. And so returning to those different areas along the West Coast, what they encountered was, unfortunately, an economy that was struggling, a job market that was very challenging. And over time, across history, what we've also seen is that anti-Asian xenophobia and anti-Asian racism tends to rise whenever there's a dip in the economy or whenever the job market is struggling. So ultimately, what these individuals, as they returned back to these different places along the West Coast and across the country, encountered were just violent attacks and harmful attitudes. And there's history of lynchings, of mob riots, of even burning of Chinatowns across the country. What this slide offers us a chance to remember is how this xenophobia and racism translated into the different cartoons and marketing ads that were placed in the local newspapers. On the left-hand side is actually a marketing ad for a washing machine company that was targeted towards Chinese. In the middle of the page, we see that some of that racism and xenophobia that was initially targeted to Chinese expanded to other Asian and Pacific Islander groups. So South Asians in the middle of the page and Filipinos on the right-hand side of the page. And ultimately, that racism and xenophobia made its way into our country's immigration policies. So on the left-hand side of the screen, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I'm sure as many of you know, was the first time that our country explicitly forbid a certain group of folks from a country from being able to immigrate and naturalize to the US. And while there were exceptions to that rule in terms of merchants or scholars or people who had significant amounts of wealth. This really started a chain of different immigration policies that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, that by 1934 ultimately created a barrier to immigration for most Asian and Pacific Islander countries, with the exception of any countries that were considered territories of the US. So let me just pause there and allow my moderator, Wade, to come on screen to see if there might be any questions early about any of this early racism and xenophobia.
Okay, let me introduce our moderator for Q&A, is Wei Gang. She is a PhD candidate for the Department of Anthropology of Princeton University. And if you guys have any question, instead of typing in the chat box, please type it in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Esther, and for hosting this event. And Ed, I want to thank you for sharing your personal experience immigrating here. And I just sort of want to add on that I also immigrated to the U.S. when I was 9. And it's amazing how little I've learned over the course of my education here. I'm a 4th-year graduate student now, of our community's history in the U.S. So I think it's so important that you share the Angel Islands immigration station's history with as many people as we can. So we actually have one couple of questions already from our audience. Someone would like to know if there's any way to find out about the different ethnic minorities that immigrated to the U.S. I think this audience member has a daughter from China, and she's curious about where might be possible historical collections or resources that she could turn to find out that information.
Sure thing. So thank you, Alice, for that question. So when I say that there's 50 different ethnic minorities, what I'm talking about is that the term Asian Pacific Islander is a political construct. I think if you were to ask anyone, how do you identify? Most of us would probably say the country that we were born in or our country of origin. We would say that we're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Guamanian, perhaps. And so that's what I mean by ethnic minorities. I recognize that within each of those Asian countries, there are also minority groups within those countries, but that's how I was using the term of ethnic minorities. Some people might call it country of origin.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. And then Jasmine would like, I guess this is a question for you, Ed, if there's one immigration story that has stayed with you.
Thanks, Jasmine, for that question. I think all of us have a version of our own immigration stories. And so for me, it's so hard to say, to pick one story out of everything. But definitely one of the things that I do appreciate about the job that I'm in now is the opportunity to connect with people all around the country and even from across the globe, and to hear about each of our own personal immigration stories. A lot of times there are threads of similarities in our experiences in terms of how we're treated as being less than or being treated as an other in the places that we call home. But what is also very inspiring across many of the immigration stories that I've had the privilege of listening to is the strength, the resiliencies that so many different immigrant families have had the opportunity and had the struggle to try to preserve as they've faced obstacles, as they faced acculturating to a new home, as they faced just even trying to understand a culture that they may not have grown up in.
Yes, definitely. I think part of my experience is that my family and I didn't share or speak about our experiences with other people. And so I think there's that sense of isolation or just not being aware that this is occurring in our stories with each other. Team would like to know if you could expand a little bit about each of the immigration laws that you listed. Maybe give us a quick overview of some of the key points.
Sure, let me pull up that slide again for you, because there are a number of laws. So starting with the Page Act of 1875, that was actually a law that tried to stereotype Chinese women in particular as being prostitutes. And again, trying to paint this negative stereotype of immigrant communities as being less desirable and not worthy of naturalizing. The Immigration Act of 1882 created this concept of what's called likely to be a public charge. And that has actually gotten a lot of attention in recent years as previous administrations have tried to change the definition of what it meant to be likely to be a public charge. Ultimately, this was a term that was used to potentially negatively stereotype people who might be seen as a burden to society, who might require public support in order to immigrate to the US. And so it was a potential category for excluding someone from being able to immigrate. The Geary Act, I talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, so I'll skip to the Geary Act of 1892. That essentially just extended the period of time that the Chinese Exclusion Act would be in operation. For the Immigration Act of 1907, ultimately what that started to weave in was to provide increased decision-making power to medical examiners who would be able to turn away a person or an immigrant accompanying them if they were deemed to have one of the list of excludable medical conditions. So there were various diseases, various public health diseases that were added to lists of different conditions that could potentially exclude someone from being able to naturalize. What the Immigration Act of 1917 did was it created essentially this Asiatic barred zone so that it encompassed most of Asia and the Pacific, where people from these countries could not immigrate to the US. What the 1920s, let me go back there, sorry. What the 1921 Emergency Quota Act did was it limited the number of people who could enter the country to 3% of those who were already in the US. And so this act in particular was unfair in that it for Asian Pacific Islander communities, there were so many less, there were so many few, how should I say that? There were fewer of us who were living in the US at the time. And so then our numbers, our 3% of a smaller number, made it less possible for us to immigrate to the US compared to European communities and countries who had significantly more people living in the US in the 1910 census. And then finally, the Immigration Act of 1924, that started to impose some of these first permanent numerical limits. And it also started this process of having a national quota for each of these different countries based on the previous numbers from the previous acts. The final bullet point that you see is the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. And so this was actually a positive law in that it granted the country of the Philippines its independence from the US. But once the Philippines was no longer considered a territory of the US, then Filipinos joined the list of Asian Pacific Islander countries who were barred from naturalizing.
Wow, great. Thank you so much for going through all of that for us, Ed. I think that maybe we can move on to the next portion of your presentation, and then we'll get to some of the other questions as we move along.
Sounds good, Wei. And as I'm looking at some of these questions, some of these are things that I'm planning to speak about in my presentation. So for those of you that ask some of those questions, please hold tight and we will definitely get to them. So let me talk a little bit about Angel Island itself. For those of you who may not have visited Angel Island before, Angel Island is actually the largest island in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is about 1 square mile. And what's important to remember is that the US Immigration Station only occupied a small portion of the northeast sector of the entire island. The island itself sits on the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok Indians and was colonized by Mexico and then was taken over by the US military after the Spanish-American War. After that, the military established various forts across the island and then ultimately a quarantine station on the island. There was actually a separate immigration station processing center directly in San Francisco on the wharfs, but those quickly became overcrowded, and there were concerns from the immigration officials that there was too much opportunity for communication between detainees and the local community. So they wanted a more remote immigration station. And that's how Angel Island got selected as a location for this immigration station. The station was built in 1910 and was modeled in several ways, except on a smaller scale, after Ellis Island in New York. There are two other key events that are integral to the history of immigration from Asia and the Pacific in these historical times. One is on the left-hand side of the screen, the case of the US versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, which established birthright citizenship. Anyone born on US soil was considered a US citizen. And then the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and resulting fires. And so this natural tragedy ultimately destroyed some of the administration buildings in San Francisco. And with those buildings, the birth records for the city disappeared. And so it created this unique window of opportunity where many of the Chinese laborers who had been forbidden from becoming US citizens by previous laws claimed birthright citizenship. They claimed that they were born in the US. And when they were asked about proof of that, they said that those documents disappeared in the earthquake and fire. And so at the time, what they also claimed was because if you were the son of a daughter that was born abroad of a US citizen, you could be brought over to the US. Not only did these laborers claim that they were US citizens, but they also had multiple sons and daughters living in China that they wanted to bring over. And so this created this process or this occurrence known as paper sons and daughters, where people were they bought these false identities of these US citizens and claimed to be their sons or daughters. And the US government caught on to this practice. And that's part of the reason that they wanted to establish the US immigration station at Angel Island, was they needed a larger place where they could interrogate and detain people as they underwent this vetting process to try to authenticate the identities of people, especially from China and from across Asia and the Pacific, who were coming to the US. So on the left-hand side is an example of a certificate of residence that, that people would purchase. And then on the right-hand side was that for these immigrants coming over to the US, they understood that part of the process of entering would be having to pass this very intensive interrogation. And so they studied these coaching books of just numbers of different questions about where they grew up, their families, their neighbors, things that the immigration officials might ask them in an attempt to validate their identity. And so in the interrogation process, they would ask these questions of the immigrant detainee, and then they would ask the same questions to the person who they claimed was their relative. And so if those questions didn't match up, then that was potentially raise questions about the validity of someone's identity. So with the creation of the US immigration station at Angel Island, unfortunately, the racism and xenophobia at the time wasn't restricted to the broader community, but we saw some very racist attitudes by the administrators of the immigration station. And so on this slide, you see a letter that was written by Dr. M.W. Glover. And so he oversaw the US Public Health Services operations at Angel Island. And similar to the quote that you saw from the California Supreme Court Justice, this is a quote that just, again, reiterates how Asians and Chinese were seen as being dirty, as being disease barriers. And if these were the attitudes that the administration officials carried with them, you can imagine that the treatment and the policies and the procedures had echoes of racism and xenophobia as well, unfortunately. So in these next couple of slides, what I want to provide you an opportunity to do is to literally walk in the footsteps of what it might have been like to have been an immigrant from Asia and the Pacific coming to the US and getting processed through Angel Island. On the left-hand side of the screens, you'll see historical pictures. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see what the site looks like now and hopefully extra incentive to come and visit the site. So we have to remember that back then there weren't planes that would bring passengers over. And so most often it was on steamship boats that we would cross the Pacific Ocean. And that journey took anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. If we happened to be lucky enough to have significant wealth, we might have traveled in a more comfortable first class cabin. But we know from historical accounts and from steamship records that the majority of Asian and Pacific Islander immigrants actually traveled in steerage in third class. And so it was a much less comfortable journey across the Pacific Ocean for them. After that 3-week journey and arriving into San Francisco Bay, we would be greeted on our ship by administration officials and immigration officials. The people who were in first class had the privilege of being able to answer questions and undertake any medical examinations in the privacy of their first class cabins. And in most cases, if there wasn't a question about someone's wealth or about their identity, they might have had the opportunity to actually depart directly to San Francisco. But if there were questions, if we were in third class, or if there was questions about our identity, or if there were questions about whether we might be likely to be a public charge or have a excludable medical condition, then we were then put on a ferry boat to Angel Island. And what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is exactly what immigrants and detainees landing at Angel Island would have seen. So just imagine that we're crossing the Pacific Ocean. We're bringing the hopes and expectations, not only that we hold internally ourselves, but also perhaps of our families, perhaps even of our village. In certain cases, villages pulled money together to send a person to the US in hopes of helping to send money back to that village. And so there's all this tremendous pressure and expectation and this excitement. And all of a sudden, instead of getting to land in San Francisco, we're ferried to what is essentially a prison and detention center. We would have been forced to leave our baggage on the shed here and make our way into the administration building that you see in front of you. I do want to point out that on the right-hand side of the screen, what you see is actually the detention barracks and not the administration building. The administration building would have stood in front of the detention barracks, but unfortunately it burned down in 1940. So on the right-hand side of the screen, what you can see is the concrete outlines of the administration building that were put in during a renovation of the site back in 2009. So after walking down the wharf, we would have undertaken a short registration process, and then we would have undergone medical examinations. And from the moment that someone steps foot on Angel Island, we know that there's a history of segregation. So men were segregated from women, Asians were segregated from non-Asians, and Chinese were actually segregated from other Asian communities. For Asian detainees, we actually underwent more specific and more intensive medical examinations. This left-hand side picture is a historical photo, although we believe it's a posed photo, in that from some of the accounts of immigrants who were detained at Angel Island, they talked about how they were forced to strip completely naked. For Chinese and Asian women in particular, we know that this was especially humiliating because of the culture of the time. You didn't disrobe in front of someone of the opposite gender. And especially for immigrants, imagine that if you were Chinese or if you were an Asian for whom the color white actually symbolizes death. The white lab coats are what the doctors wore at the time. And so as someone who didn't speak English, you're walking into this hall, into this room, and you're faced with these staff who are wearing these white coats that symbolize death, and then forced to undertake these medical examinations, which included not only stripping publicly naked, but also submitting blood and stool samples. And what the medical examiners were looking for were various public health diseases like trachoma, like liver flukes, like roundworm. And these were medical conditions that were on a list of things where if you had this medical condition, you were sent to the hospital building for treatment. And if you couldn't afford treatment, or if your condition wasn't cured, then that was actually grounds for deportation. Now, public health and the selection of these medical conditions is also where we see racism and xenophobia, in that for some of these public health conditions, it's not that they were that dangerous to the broader public. It was that they happened to be conditions that were prevalent, that were common among Asian Pacific Islander communities. And so that's how those particular diseases got added to the list of medical conditions, in that it was just another opportunity, another reason to potentially exclude an Asian Pacific Islander detainee from entering the US. On the right-hand side is an image of what this exact room actually looks like now. After a $12 million 7-year renovation, we're really excited to be opening the Angel Island Immigration Museum in the former Public Health Services Hospital building on the site. And just for comparison to what happened at Ellis Island, so often when we think about immigration, many of us think about the symbolism that the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island represent in terms of how our country has welcomed immigrants to the US. But for immigrants on Ellis Island, most often they were just briefly processed. They spent maybe a couple hours on Ellis Island and then were allowed to enter the US. Their medical examinations were just a quick line inspection, where essentially the doctors literally just walked past and quickly glanced at the immigrants to determine if they had any of these medical conditions. And they did this, the detainees were fully clothed when they did this. So a very different experience on Ellis Island compared to the Asian detainees on Angel Island. What was also different was the length of detention. So at Ellis Island, detainees typically spent 3 to 4 hours. Ellis Island was set up more as a processing center as opposed to a detention center. Whereas for Angel Island detainees, the majority of folks spent anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks if you were non-Asian. And then if you were Asian, it could be anywhere from 3 days up to 2 years. Chinese detainees spent the most time on Angel Island on average. Their periods of detention typically lasted anywhere from 3 weeks up to 3 months. And so we know that the detention barracks also were an example of disparate treatment, where for the non-Asian detainees on Angel Island, the conditions were far less cramped because there were fewer people compared to the Chinese and Asian detainees. And so on the left-hand side is a historic photo of the bunks that detainees slept on. For Chinese men, for the first year or two that the Angel Island Immigration Station was open, they were not provided cots. They were not provided sleeping mats to sleep on and had to sleep on these metal cots. But ultimately, they were given mats. On the right-hand side is a recreation of what the bunks and barrack spaces looked like. And so we know in rooms that were supposed to only house about 50 people, in many of the Asian detention rooms, there were actually as many as 150 to 200 people. We also know that dining was very different for Asian detainees compared to non-Asian detainees. The government actually spent more money on the meals for non-Asian detainees, for Europeans, compared to Asian detainees. It was about 13 cents, 12 to 13 cents for European detainees, and about 11 cents for Asian detainees, which back then was a significant difference. The quality of the food for Asian detainees was so poor that it made its way into some of the poems that were carved on the walls, the description of the food, not the food itself. But the poor quality of the food is talked about in some of the poems that are in the detention barracks. And there were also food protests and food riots talking about how the food was essentially pig slop and the poor taste and poor quality. And then ultimately, we would have spent time in those detention barracks, not knowing when we would be called forward for these interrogations, which were called boards of special inquiry hearings. And again, for Asian detainees, for Chinese detainees in particular, these boards of special inquiry, these interrogations where we were asked hundreds of different questions to verify our identity. Things like, What is the color of the floor in your home? What is the name of the neighbor who lives 3 doors down from you? How many steps are in your house? Those are all things, examples of things that we would have been asked. And while they might seem pretty simple, when you think about these questions in the context of being asked hundreds of different questions, we can imagine that this was a very strenuous and stressful process for these detainees. Very often, the Chinese detainees ended up failing this initial special board of special inquiry hearing, but luckily they had the opportunity to appeal, and it was in those appeals processes that their initial turning down of being allowed into the country was overturned, and often those appeals would take several weeks or months to process. And that's why the detention periods for Chinese detainees is usually significantly longer than for other detainees. And so before I pause for Q&A, I just want to note that oftentimes for folks who are familiar with the history of Angel Island, they think of it as a Chinese detention center or Chinese immigration station. And definitely the majority of people who were detained on Angel Island were of Chinese descent. We know that ultimately about 500,000 people, though, from 80 different countries were either detained or processed through Angel Island in the period that it was open, from 1910 to 1940. And so it's important to remember both of those histories, both how Asians and Pacific Islanders were forced to go through Angel Island because of the country's exclusionary immigration laws, but also that other immigrants from other countries also experienced some of these same challenges and same processes. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and have Wei come back on so that we can take some of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Ed. Just picking up on the last thing that you said about how detainees came from 80 different countries. I believe Ray has a question regarding if the relationships between different ethnicities within the station itself. I think this is perhaps what he means. Because we know, obviously there's a racism discrimination from the US government toward immigrants, but maybe among them, you can speak to that.
Sure. So we know that between 1910 and 1940, there was historical tension between different countries in Asia. And so I think that's part of what led to the segregation of Chinese from other Asian detainees. Also, the number of Chinese detainees and the specific Chinese exclusion laws at various points in history meant that there were significantly more Chinese. And so that's part of, I think, the reason that Chinese were segregated from others. But at times the station would get so crowded that inevitably people from different Asian Pacific Islander countries would get intermingled in the same room.
Right. Is there a database of names that passed through the Angel Island immigration station?
There unfortunately is not a database of names. The station stopped being used as an immigration station in 1940 after a fire broke out in the administration building. And so much like the 1906 fire destroyed many of the birth records of the time, the 1940 fire at the administration building on the site burned down, and we lost most of the paperwork of who was detained on Angel Island. What we do have, though, are some of the ship records and passenger lists of different steamships that came to the US at that time from Asia. And many of those records are available at the National Archives, particularly the one in San Bruno here on the West Coast, but they're not complete lists. And so our estimate of the 500,000 people that were processed or detained through Angel Island is just that, it's an estimate.
That's so unfortunate. Wilson has a question. He wants to know, were there other US immigration stations between Canada and Washington State and Mexico and California / southwestern states to detain and interrogate immigrants from Asia, or did all Asian immigrants come through Angel Island?
Thanks for that question, Wilson. The majority of immigrants came through San Francisco. That was the primary port of entry, but there were definitely immigration stations in Los Angeles, in Seattle, and I just recently learned 3 months ago that there was also a small immigration station right on the border of Oregon and Washington State.
And were the detention practices similar in those other stations as well?
Yes, because those detention centers were also intended to enforce the exclusionary immigration policies of the time.
Okay. Were immigrants aware that there was a difference between Ellis Island as a more welcoming processing center versus Angel Island as a detention center?
It probably varies. We do know that there are some instances, particularly with Filipino communities, where because of that Tiding-McDuffie's Act that granted Filipinos the independence, there was actually one ship that had departed from the Philippines to the US. And the time it took for them to get to the Philippines to the US, the Tiding-McDuffie's Act passed. So they left Philippines with the opportunity to enter the US. But by the time they got to the US, they were shuttled to Angel Island.
Wow. I actually had a question about the coaching books that you mentioned, and also this practice of paper sons and daughters. And I was wondering if you know anything about the sort of support networks that would have made those practices possible. Like how were the coaching books disseminated, back to different countries in Asia for them to kind of practice before they landed?
Right. Yeah, so that was actually part of the process of purchasing a paper son or paper daughter certificate. Is oftentimes it came with this coaching book that the immigrants would study. And we also know that in places like San Francisco, there was a robust Chinese community, and these associations helped to support immigrants. There wasn't any contact allowed between the detainees in Angel Island and these support organizations. But what would happen is the staff, the cooks in Angel Island were often Chinese, and they often helped to ferry secret messages between some of these support organizations and some of the detainees on Angel Island, typically for a fee. And so there are a couple of images that we've seen where there's secret notes that are written on the inside of an orange peel or inside a banana peel, or a slip of paper that is placed under someone's plate in the detention center.
Wow, that's fascinating. I don't know if maybe if we have time, you can speak a little bit more about the vetting or identification process. For instance, how did immigration officers know about immigrants' potential home villages, their families, whether or not they were born or children of people who were born in the US, and other personal information?
Right. So what they would do is they would ask the questions of the detainees, and then because those paper sons and paper daughter certificates named a relative in the US, they would then ask the same questions of a relative in the US or an assumed relative in the US. And what's interesting about that interrogation process is that even if that was your true identity, and there are several cases where they legitimately were the son and daughter of someone already in the US, but they failed the interrogation process because of just how intensive the questions were, how many questions there were, or how things changed. In some cases, maybe there was only one window in a bedroom when the relative left, but in the 3 to 5 years since that relative left and this new immigrant detainees coming over, they might have put in an additional window. And so that was sometimes cause for a discrepancy in answers.
Wow, that's incredibly, very, very intense. I have a question from Christina, who would like to know if, what are some of the reasons why people are so interested in coming here?
So I think, when we think about immigration to the U.S., whether it was back when Angel Island was open or even now, so often it's for opportunity or because we're trying to escape violence or escape dangerous situations, whether it's war, whether it's political turmoil. And so that back then definitely was true, and it continues to be true now. I know for my family, again, the opportunity, there was this thought that there was a chance in the US to have a better chance at living, a better future. And for my parents in particular, I know they came over here to the US with the hopes of sending money back home to support our families back there. And what they found instead was how difficult it was to make it here in the US. And my parents ended up working overtime and double shifts sometimes to try to make ends meet. Wei, I'm wondering if we should move on to the final section of slides, just in the interest of time.
I do want to just quickly touch on Sue's question, which
Okay.
you mentioned that all the ships docked in San Francisco and then some were ferried to the island, but she was told that her father had jumped ship, and I was wondering if you knew of any instances of that happening.
I actually haven't heard about that happening, but definitely part of what we want to do at Angel Island is if any of you happen to have ancestors or family members who might have come through Angel Island or immigrated at that time, whether through Angel Island or through other places, we are collecting stories of immigrant journeys through our Immigrant Voices project. And I'll place into chat in just a little bit the website where you can see some of the stories that have already been submitted. But definitely, if you have your own immigration stories, please take the opportunity to submit your story. And even if you are a recent immigrant coming to the US now, we want our collection of stories to encompass both those historical stories as well as contemporary stories.
Great, look forward to that. So please, Ed, to your last question.
Great. And so what I wanted to spend the remaining time I have with all of you is just sharing with you a little bit more about what the site looks like now and what folks have to look forward to. And so before I go there, just a quick shout out to some of perhaps the more famous and more notable Angel Island detainees. As you look at the screen, perhaps there are names that might be familiar to you. So we know that I.M. Pei actually spent a couple of hours on Angel Island. He happened to be very lucky in that he came on a student visa and he also had significant proof of his wealth. And so his processing experience is probably very different from those detainees who spent more time on Angel Island. Tyrus Wong in the middle went on to become a Disney animator, and he came over as a 10-year-old boy. And so that also parallels what we're seeing along the southern border now, where there are children and women and families who are placed in detention centers. So Angel Island is perhaps a precursor to what we're seeing now along the southern border. And then on the right-hand side, the Bagai family was detained on Angel Island. And one of the young boys pictured in this photo is Ram Bagai, who later became president of the Hollywood Foreign Press, which many of us have just witnessed award season. The Hollywood Foreign Press is responsible for the Golden Globe ceremony and awards. So after 1940, when the administration building burned down, the hospital building as well as the detention barracks still remained. And so those buildings were used during World War II to house enemy POWs, as well as to temporarily process Japanese and Japanese Americans. Right after Pearl Harbor, but before the passage of Executive Order 9066, there were about 600 Japanese and Japanese Americans who were deemed enemy aliens and were arrested and brought to Angel Island. There were also about an additional 100 Japanese and Japanese Americans along the West Coast who were brought to Angel Island. And they spent some time on Angel Island before being relocated to other war relocation authority centers across the US. After World War II, the military ultimately abandoned the site in 1946, and many of the buildings fell into disrepair and decay. California State Parks took over stewardship of the site in the 1950s. And by the time the 1970s rolled around, there were actually plans to demolish all the buildings on the site to make way for new picnic sites and new campsites. But very, very fortunately, there was a park ranger by the name of Alexander Weiss who had heard rumors that there were Chinese poems carved into the walls of the detention barracks. So he brought a number of local Asian American scholars and advocates into the building with his trusty flashlight, and they quote unquote rediscovered these poems. And ultimately, it was these poems that saved the buildings. They allowed us to claim California historic landmark status for the buildings to keep them from getting torn down. And then ultimately in 1997, securing national historic landmark status for the site. What you see on this screen is the best preserved poem on the site. What we know about all these different poems is that they're very intricately and very beautifully carved. And many of the poems make literary references. So the people who wrote the poems were well educated. Many of the poems capture some of the experiences as well as the emotions of hope, of despair, of frustration, of the different conditions and processes that the detainees had to endure. And so this is one of the poems that is in the site. But what I wanted to take a moment to read out loud is this other poem, poem 24, that many of the poems, we don't know who authored them. They were considered graffiti by the administration officials, and so they were puttied and painted over. But ultimately that process ended up preserving the poems as the putty dried over the years and fell out. That's how we've been able to find many of these poems. This particular poem we know was written by someone by the name of Yu of Toishan, and it's called Random Thoughts Deep at Night. So in the quiet of night, I heard faintly the whistling of wind. The forms and shadows saddened me. Upon seeing the landscape, I composed a poem. The floating clouds, the fog, darken the sky. The moon shines faintly as insects chirp. Grief and bitterness entwined are heaven sent. The sad person sits alone, leaning by a window. And so for me, this is a very eloquent reminder of what it was like to be a detainee and to try to hold both the hope while also perhaps facing increasing frustration from being detained. So the site did fall into significant disrepair, and the pictures that you see on this slide are evidence of what the hospital building actually looked like before it was renovated. And I am very excited to share with you that this is what the hospital building looks like now. This is actually the welcome room to what we are reimagining the hospital building as, which is the Angel Island Immigration Museum. And one of the things that makes me excited about this museum is that in addition to lifting up the histories of those who came through Angel Island, we are also incorporating the histories and stories of immigrants who came after Angel Island closed. So embedded in the different exhibits in the museum are also the stories of people who came after the Immigration Act of 1965, immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers who came in the 70s and 80s and even now. So this is one of the exhibits rooms. It's called In the Shadows, and all of the exhibits in this room focus on the exclusionary immigration policies or the different obstacles that made it harder for immigrants from Asia and from other countries to come to the US. Because the museum is located in the hospital building, we wanted to have some exhibits that told the history of how the building was used as a hospital. And so Under the Microscope is the name of this exhibit. And then finally, the Opening Doors exhibit. And in this exhibit, we also wanted to celebrate the strength, the resiliency, and the contributions that immigrants have made to US culture, to US economics, to US society. And so in this exhibit room, we are able to share many of the diverse histories and journeys that immigrants have taken, both those who came through Angel Island as well as those who came afterwards. And so while I hope that all of you have the opportunity to visit Angel Island, I recognize that that might not be possible for some folks to come and visit us in person. And so perhaps the next best thing is this virtual 3D tour that we just launched last month. And so I'll type this into the chat box as well. But if you click on this hyperlink, you'll have a chance to see two of the rooms inside the barracks building. And so with that, I want to thank you all again for your time and attention and for joining me and at Chinese American Heritage Foundation for this presentation. I know that we're right at the end of time, but I'm willing to stay on to answer any additional questions that y'all might have. And I hope that you have the opportunity to visit us. I hope that you stay in contact with us by visiting our website or by following us on social media.
Thank you so much, Ed. I think a lot of people are really taken with the image of the poems on the wall. So is there an archive or a database of all of the ones that have been found, and about how many would you say?
We estimate that there's about 200 poems that were carved. We don't know the exact location of all of those poems. But there's been some amazing research that's been done previously by Hin-Mark Lai and Judy Young in their book called Island. And then more recently, Charles Egan, a professor at San Francisco State University, published a book called Voices that also includes some of the other inscriptions. Chinese were the only ones to write poems, but there are many other inscriptions that Dr. Egan had the opportunity to research and tell more of the story of. And I also do want to just point out this book, which is called Angel Island, Immigrant Gateway to America by Erica Lee and Judy Young. And this is definitely one of my go-to reference books about the history of Angel Island.
Wow. Do you know that if there are translation efforts underway? One very helpful audience member pointed out that in the presentation, the translation was flipped, and I was curious if how many untranslated poems there are. And if there are volunteers in the audience who would like to help in that endeavor.
Thank you for pointing that out. I don't speak Chinese myself, even though my grandparents are from China, so I will definitely make that correction. There definitely have been various efforts over the years to translate the poems, so that was probably not an error on their part. That was an error on my part.
It's okay. I make that kind of mistake all the time, even in English. Were there any detainees that tried to escape, or were there suicide attempts or successful suicides?
I definitely know that there were suicide attempts. There are some records of a Chinese woman who unfortunately hanged herself in the women's bathroom on site. It was a detention center, and so I don't know any particular stories of people who tried to escape, but I imagine that given the conditions that people lived in, given the frustration, that there might have been. But the challenge too is that Angel Island is very physically removed from the rest of San Francisco Bay. It would have been more than a mile and a half swim to the nearest shoreline. And the currents in San Francisco Bay are very strong. So that might have probably also deterred potential escapes because there's nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a tough history to learn, I think, especially for myself, even not knowing about this Angel Island immigration station and just hearing about it. It's harrowing, I think, to say the least. What do you think are some of the lessons that happened at Angel Island immigration station that can teach us about sort of our contemporary immigration issues that are affecting other communities now too?
I think part of the lesson is just that this happened. So similar to you, Wei, I never learned about Angel Island in school growing up in Texas. I didn't even learn about it in college. And so for those of us who are familiar with Angel Island's history, who learn about Angel Island history, I think there's an opportunity for us now to make sure that we're talking with our family members about what happened at Angel Island, talking with our friends about what happened at Angel Island, so that we continue to uplift this important part of history, of not just Asian American history or Pacific Islander history, but US history that still too many people don't recognize. And particularly at a time where our communities, Asian Pacific Islander communities, are facing increased racism and xenophobia, and perhaps this myth of the model minority, that we're wealthy and well-educated and perhaps immune from experiencing racism. What happened at Angel Island continues on today. And so it is an important reminder that this racism and xenophobia isn't new and has existed over time, unfortunately.
What are some of the things that perhaps the Angel Island Immigration Station and Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation can do in terms of collaborating with educators or other organizations to teach younger generations about this history?
That's a great question, because my hope is definitely every student across the US will learn about Angel Island. And so we, several years ago, developed an educational curriculum that is primarily for grades 3 through 12. If you go to our website, you can find those educational curriculums free of charge to download. And so they can perhaps be used by either teachers or even by parents who want to think about different ways to help talk to their kids, to their sons and daughters about what happened at Angel Island in an age-appropriate way.
What do you hope to see with the Angel Island Immigration Station Museum in the future as things start to return slowly back to some semblance of normalcy?
Some semblance of normal, right? Unfortunately, all the buildings on Angel Island have been closed since the beginning of the pandemic. So for us, it's been since March of last year. We are hoping that later this year, the buildings will be reopened. At this point in time, people can come to Angel Island and hike on the trails and bike on the trails, but they can't enter any of the buildings. With the opening of the Angel Island Immigration Museum, I think my personal hope is definitely that more people feel a sense of understanding, of empathy, and connection to the immigration experience, whether it was immigration by Asian Pacific Islanders or immigration by other people from other countries around the world. And to think and ponder about, as we think about the world around us today and the world that we want to have in the future, what does it look like to treat everyone with respect and fairness, regardless of where we were born or what language we speak or how we identify?
It's such a wonderfully positive message. I thank you so much. And I hope, that Angel Island can be a must-see sort of site for anybody who visits San Francisco or anywhere in California. I know it's a big state, but still, it should be one of those places, just like the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. It should be on everyone's radar. So sort of a logistical question, is it accessible via ferries or boats? Are there regularly running routes to the island?
Yes, so during normal times, there are ferries running from San Francisco to Angel Island, as well as from Tepporn, which is a town north of San Francisco, to Angel Island. During COVID, both of those ferries have reduced their service. So currently, ferry service is only available on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. And unfortunately, the ferry service provider from San Francisco to Angel Island, the Blue and Gold Fleet, put in an application back in September of last year to permanently stop their service. And so we've been trying to raise awareness that this is happening and to draw attention to the need to have direct ferry service from San Francisco to Angel Island. It would be the equivalent of not having ferry service from New York to the Statue of Liberty. And so hopefully there is another ferry service provider company that will come in and step in. And we've heard that there's at least one company that's interested. And so we hope that that does come to fruition, because it would definitely impact visitation to Angel Island if there wasn't ferry service.
How can everyday folk help support the work of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, and also even to bring awareness to this need for a ferry service?
Thank you for that question, Alice. So what I will do is I will type into chat, the California Public Utilities Commission is the regulating authority that will make the final decision on the Blue and Gold Fleet's application. If people could take a quick moment to submit a public comment about the need for continued ferry service directly from San Francisco to Angel Island, that would be wonderful.
I guess this could be our last question. There is a talk about a statue or monument to recognize immigration to the West Coast. Is that accurate? And if so, is Angel Island the sort of location for a possible Statue of Liberty on the West Coast?
That would be wonderful to have some sort of magnet monument. So similar, we know that many people visit Ellis Island because they have to ride the ferry to go to the Statue of Liberty, and it happens to pass by Ellis Island. And so similarly, we would love to have a monument that talks about what immigration looks like on the West Coast, the challenges that immigrants experience, but also the ongoing contributions that immigrants and their descendants have made. And so that's not something that will probably happen in the next year or two, but it is something that is part of my North Star for the site.
Absolutely. So the island itself is already a historic site. So I imagine if folks petition their local lawmakers, this could be something that could be put into motion.
Exactly.
Everyone become civically engaged. So with that, thank you so much, Ed, for this incredible presentation. I've learned so much. And it's really sobering to think about how we should all remember this history and move forward into this month, but more so this year and onward. So Esther, back to you.
Hi, well, thank you so much. Wei, you can stay on. You can show your video. We still love to see you, because I would really want to thank Ed. Your presentation is extraordinary. I mean, I loved it. There's so many information and there's so much I didn't know. And thank you so much. And Wei as well, thank you so much for being our moderator. It's a wonderful job. And thank you for all the questions from the attendees as well. And before we go, we would like to remind that we have all the webinars in May, and we'll be updating our website, www.cahf.us/AAPI talks, TALKS. So I already typed it in the chat box. So please go to the website, maybe every day or every other day. We'll be keep adding new links onto it. So right now we have 8 days and a few other extra days in it. So we want to make sure everything is really all set before we post it on it, before you register. So we'll love to see you again. In fact, tomorrow, 8 o'clock, and the talk is from 3 Coins book talk by Dr. Russell Lowe. So I hope you guys can join us for that as well. So we any more questions that need to be answered before we logged off? Make sure, please go to the chat box, because I know Ed already typed in a lot of website on it. And I believe I will be able to save that chat. And if you guys needed something from me, please feel free to email me. My email address, I will type it in again, is cahf.us@gmail.com. Okay, all right. So thank you everyone for joining us. Hope to see you tomorrow. Again, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Wei, for everything. Goodbye. Have a good night, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
Thank you
Yes,
so much, Esther.
definitely, yes.
Milton too.